In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry, and been widely regarded as a bad move. Douglas Adams, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe.
Okay, we are live.
There's a real wrong and a real right.
I think everyone does know that God exists, assuming you do.
Simply because they don't want...
I think the answer is actually kind of already in the question there. We are the Mentionables.
Hello, you are listening to the Mentionables podcast with me, Joel Furchess.
And I'm Clinton Wilcox.
Today on the Mentionables, why did God choose to create anything? Wouldn't a world with just God be a better world? We're going to discuss that and talk about the various arguments for and against this particular topic. Before we do, what have you been doing in apologetics, and why aren't you at the ETS conference today, Clinton?
Well, like some friends of mine, like Cody Nelson, I saw him post a meme on Facebook about how he's like, well, I've never seen SpongeBob SquarePants, so I can't really accurately reproduce the meme, but it's like Squidward.
What kind of childhood did you have?
Well, that was after my time. I grew up on X-Men, Batman the Animated Series, and Gargoyles.
Good man.
So I had a much different upbringing than kids today, but that actually dates me a little bit. I grew up as a kid in the '90s, but so Squidward kind of looking longingly on while Patrick and SpongeBob are like having a great time. It's like,
well, at least you know the names of all the characters.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I have nieces who watch these kinds of shows. So yeah, I'm kind of where my associate Cody Nelson is, and it's like I'm stuck here at home. I just don't have the money to go to the ETS conference. I would have loved to, because other friends of mine are there, and speakers that I respect are there, and I would love to see live at some point. And actually, speakers that I've shared a conference with are there too, because Gary Habermas is there, and I got to do a breakout session at a conference that he was one of the keynote speakers at. So that's one of the highlights of my apologetics career so far. But
until today, I didn't know what the ETS conference was.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I learned about it on the same meme that you just mentioned.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they have one. I think it's in Dallas or Houston this week.
Okay.
But there's also one.
We should get on Mark's case for not being there. After all, he's in Texas, so I'm sure. I assume everything in Texas is about next door to each other, right?
Oh, yeah. Have you ever driven through Texas?
Yes, we went to a conference there at one point. Don't you recall?
I do recall. Yes. It's a very, very big state.
Our second Mentionables conference and our last Mentionables conference was in Texas.
Yeah,
we've been doing some discussion about what we want to do with the Mentionables going forward. So we'll have to discuss whether we want to do another conference at some point in the future. I would like to.
I would like to too. So yeah, I'm down for that. But so essentially, it's just I don't have the money to attend the conference, which is why I'm not there. Because doing the pro-life apologetics thing, it doesn't. It's not. There's really no money in it.
Yeah, it's not real lucrative.
Yeah, I mean,
but it comes with a lot of stress. There's that.
Yeah, and you're basically a pro-life missionary is what you are. You have to get people to donate to your ministry and basically get your salary that way. Yeah, and I'm just not good at the whole fundraising kind of thing. So my apologetics has kind of taken a bit of a back seat lately, because I recently moved to New Mexico, and I needed to do some things that are going to help bring some income in. So I've started playing with some local bands to try and at least get somewhat of a cash flow to come in. And I'm not going to quit the apologetics thing altogether, especially not the pro-life work that I've been doing. But at least until I can get to a point where where I can finance these trips, I'm gonna have to, sit them out at least until such time as I'm a little more financially stable.
All right.
So.
Okay, well, let's get into the topic for today. The topic for today originated with one of the more classic atheist thinkers. I didn't do the hard work of looking up his name, but we'll assume it was, say, Hume, or that guy from England that liked to shout at Christians on the street.
Which one? Are you talking about
the why I am not a theist or Christian, or why I am a skeptic guy. He wrote a book back in like the 1800s.
Oh.
And he was most famous for a large essay he wrote for, I believe it was titled "Why I Am a Skeptic." I remember because he spelled skeptic strange.
Oh.
But if you heard his name, you'd recognize who I was talking about.
Okay.
Relatively famous guy. Anyway, I don't know if it was him or not. Anyway, so here's the originator version of the argument. The argument goes something like this. All right, so you've got God, and God is supposed to be perfect, right? But then God does something unusual. He creates a world that is not himself. He creates something outside of himself. Now, the fact that a perfect God, allegedly, decided to, at one point, create something else indicated that God had needed something else. And a God that needs something is not a perfect God. That's the original version of this argument. Without asking for a rebuttal of that argument, any comments on the formulation of that argument?
Not specifically. It was like I told you before we started recording here, for the people listening. This is actually kind of a question that I've wrestled with myself, and I do have a way that I would respond to this, and we'll get into that later. But I remember back in Sunday school, where my Sunday school teacher told me that God wanted to create because he was lonely and wanted other beings there.
You needed to get a different Sunday school teacher.
And so I remember thinking, if God is perfect, why would he need other people around him? So these are the kinds of questions that I've wrestled with myself. So I don't really have anything really to comment on as far as the formulation goes. So, we'll get into discussions of it here shortly. So
okay, absolutely. So let me give you the more modern formulation. And this, I originally heard this formulation under the title of The Problem of Non-God Objects. Later, that was revised to a much more catchy title, titled God World. So here's how this was put. Okay, so it says that a world that exists with only a perfect being in it and nothing else. So this is God world. This is the world with just God. Is already a perfect world. If the only thing that occupies the entire universe is just a perfect being, then it is a perfect world, by definition. A perfect being would desire a perfect world, and therefore would not create objects outside of himself. Any object external to God, who is a maximally good being, is not maximally good. It might have qualities of goodness to it, but it's not maximally good. And therefore, the moment that God creates something external to himself, he introduces a new object into the universe, a non-God object, and that object is less than maximal, so he has degraded the entire quality of the universe by creating anything external to himself. But God went ahead and created an entire universe, all of which is external to himself. So you don't even have to, or, according to this argument, you wouldn't even have to bring up the problem of evil and suffering. The fact that nothing in the physical material universe excels to the level of perfection, of being maximally good, indicates that we live in a universe, without even bringing in evil and corruption, we still live in a less than perfectly good universe. And so the fact that we do live in such a universe indicates that there is no maximally good being out there that created this universe. So I spent a lot of time and qualifications in giving that. Did that come out as understandable to you?
Yeah, I was tracking with it. I think listeners who aren't necessarily philosophically inclined, that sounded like something that they could easily track with. I didn't hear anything too difficult or any advanced concepts really, except for maybe the concept of like possible worlds might be a little confusing to some people, but I was able to track with it just fine.
Well, I didn't use the term possible worlds because if Tyler ever listens in on this, that's like his least favorite. That's a trigger word for him.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
He starts frothing at the mouth.
Okay, maybe because I've read philosophers, maybe I was just thinking possible worlds in my brain as you were going. So
I mean, we're talking about two quote possible worlds, one in which only God exists and one in which other things exist.
Yeah.
I suppose a third world in which God does not exist.
Right.
Which would be the conclusion of this argument, that we live in such a world because there could not be both non-God objects and also God, assuming that by God we mean a maximally good being.
Right.
So a lot of the things that I threw around are the kinds of terms that one uses in sort of the advanced areas of apologetic philosophy. So hopefully our listeners are still tracking with me. So this is one of my favorite arguments of all time. And the reason for that, I'm going to go into the history a little bit. I heard this argument originally on a show called Reasonable Doubts, which is sort of the bizarro version of William Lane Craig's podcast, which is Reasonable Evidence?
Reasonable Faith.
Reasonable Faith. There you go. Yeah, Reasonable Faith, Reasonable Doubts. Anyway, and this was, of course, an atheist podcast. Back then, I was a Christian journalist writing specifically in the area of apologetics, and I figured if I'm going to journal things about apologetics, I should probably keep my eye on things atheist as well. So this was one of the atheist shows that I followed at the time.
Yeah.
It has since become defunct and been replaced by True Atheology, run by Benjamin Watkins, who has been featured or occasionally referenced on our show before. So at any rate, this argument was given by a host of that show called Justin Schieber, who I guess is probably still out there doing atheist things. He was featured in a debate on the Unbelievable show with Justin Brierley at one point. I believe he was talking about the conquering of, well, he wasn't talking about the conquering of Canaan, but something similar to that, where Saul rides in and annihilates a group of people, and God was okay with that.
You're talking about King Saul from the Old Testament, right?
Yes, King Saul.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so that was the subject of his debate, and that was how I originally got introduced to Unbelievable, actually, through this atheist show I was following.
Okay.
Anyway, so Schieber gives this argument at some kind of conference or meeting in front of some secularist or atheist, humanist or atheist. And at the end of this argument that he gave, which, used the terms like maximally great being and all of this stuff, he got a lot of static from the audience, who was offended that he was referencing theological concepts and philosophical concepts when none of those were empirical in nature and therefore should not be arguments for atheism.
Wow. I mean, what kind of, I guess.
Well, you may recall.
I'm wondering what kind of empirical arguments could be used in support of atheism.
Well, you may recall this is something that's been said by our classical, now very aged proponents of supposedly new atheism, who have said that philosophical arguments should be thrown out the door and that we should revert only to scientific arguments.
Right. In that case, we'd have to throw that argument they just made right out the door.
Yeah, you would... You get the impression they're not really up on the philosophy, which is probably why they're not fond of it.
Yeah.
I know. I'm not fond of being argued at from subjects that I'm not familiar with, because it's really hard to respond to those.
Right. Yeah.
So I could see how scientists would not be cool with philosophical arguments because it's not something they're capable of responding to. At any rate, yeah, so this guy got in trouble for giving that argument. The reason that this argument was meaningful to me was that it was meaningful because it got me thinking. And the subject it got me thinking on was something that I had sat there and talked with my father about for years, since I was a teenager, possibly even before. And my dad would sit me down and ask me, why did God choose to create anything? What is all this for? Why does the universe exist, and what's God's, plan with this? Now, you said your Sunday school teacher had a really good answer for that, right? Just lay that out and we should be able to finish the show.
Right, because God was lonely, and so he needed other people around him to, so that he could have a loving relationship with those people.
Oh, you just brought a tear to my eye.
Yeah,
poor God.
This is one major reason why I'm such a big proponent of getting education and apologetics in the church, because it's sorely lacking, especially in the churches that I grew up in. A lot of the arguments and criticisms I hear from atheists are easily answerable, but I understand why they make them, because growing up in churches, they were the kind of things I heard from my own Sunday school teachers. When the kinds of things they say are, a sufficiently knowledgeable atheist would be able to, dance circles around these Sunday school teachers who just don't know very good arguments for the things that they believe. And so, even though these atheist criticisms can be easily answered, if these atheists were atheists who grew up in the church and eventually left the church, well, if that's, if that's like the extent of the apologetics that they got, were the platitudes and the simplistic sorts of views from their Sunday school teachers, then, it's no wonder that those are the kinds of arguments that they're leveling at us now.
Yeah, and that kind of ties back into the research that I do, because what you find is that when you meet an atheist who used to be a Christian and he begins to throw arguments at you, he is always arguing against what he learned as a Christian. And typically what he learned wasn't great theology.
Right. And I'm not necessarily excusing the atheist either, because, I myself went through a questioning phase where I could have left the church if I didn't find answers for the questions I had. But rather than go and ask my pastor or my Sunday school teacher or people I knew wouldn't be able to give me satisfying answers, I just went out and I found books written by some of the most sophisticated Christians that I could find. Now, one of those happened to be Lee Strobel, who's a popularizer, but he wrote a book in which he interviewed Christian intellectuals. Mm-hmm. And that book, The Case for Christ, was one of the first ones that I encountered. So even though Lee Strobel himself is a popularizer, I was still getting good arguments from the people that he interviewed. I also found a book by Norm Geisler, who's a very, very top tier Christian philosopher, and a book by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity, which basically gives good reasons for our faith, but in a way that's accessible to people without apologetics or philosophy training. So, I went out there, I searched, and I read. I didn't read, like the most sophisticated philosophers or anything, but the best thinkers that I could get my hands on, I read their books and saw what they had to say, and found that there are good reasons for being a Christian, good arguments for Christianity. So I'm not necessarily excusing an atheist for never intellectually maturing. We go to college to gain knowledge, but why do we just assume that? Except
for boys who go to Jupiter to get more stupider.
Well,
sorry,
right. No, it's okay. No, I definitely heard that.
Flashback, really.
Yeah, I definitely heard that growing up. But we go to college to gain more knowledge and education. So why would anyone think that there aren't better thinkers than than the Sunday school teacher that I had as a kid? Why wouldn't we look to see if there are scientists and philosophers who have grappled with these questions and given us any sorts of satisfying answers. So I don't necessarily think an atheist is excused by only having been exposed to these kinds of arguments from Sunday school teachers and pastors who never went to seminary. But I am saying that I do think it's understandable, even though I don't think it's necessarily excusable.
Okay, so to get into my thoughts on this argument, which I never thought I would find a satisfying answer to the question of why did God choose to create, which was the ultimate question my dad had. He considered that to be the question, and that was his lifelong query. And we would sit there and we'd think about it and we'd be like, well, maybe God wanted to reveal himself or demonstrate himself. And, the response that my dad would give is, to whom did he want to reveal? Did he create an audience so that he could then show off in front of that audience? That doesn't make any sense. That makes about as much sense as he created humans because he was lonely. So that was not a satisfying answer to that question. So are you familiar with the invisible gardener argument, sometimes also argued under the invisible dragon argument?
I don't believe so.
All right. So it goes like this. I'll give the invisible dragon version because it's easier.
Okay.
The invisible gardener requires me to...
Yeah, I was going to say, and dragons are cooler too. So
yeah, that's true. Yeah, the invisible gardener would require me to tell an entire parable. The invisible dragon is sort of your village atheist version of the same argument.
Okay.
Which goes like this. Clinton, I have a dragon in my garage. You want to see him?
Sure.
Well, you can't because he's an invisible dragon.
Oh, I've definitely heard this kind of argument from village atheists. Usually I hear it as an invisible pink elephant, though.
Well, let's go with the dragon because that's how I started.
Okay, that's
all
fine.
right. So,
well, sure. Yeah, I'd love to see your invisible dragon.
Well, you can't. He's invisible.
Now,
well,
does he make noises? Can I hear him?
No. He doesn't make any noises either. He's invisible and he's silent.
Oh, okay. That's too bad.
Yeah. Oh, also, he doesn't occupy space, so you couldn't feel him or anything.
Okay. So
but he speaks to my heart, and that's why I know he's there.
So how can I know you even have a dragon in the first place?
Just take my word for it. So yeah, and then it would end with this. What is the difference between a invisible, intangible, silent, inactive being and no being at all? And so this is the question that would, obviously they would transfer this to God then. You say God cannot be seen. Invisibility is one of his things. And he doesn't, he won't at least speak on command. We can't, the atheist, can't ever hear him. And you're giving me this book that was written by human beings and saying that this is evidence for God. Not that you would probably use that specific argument, but
right.
The point is, what is the difference between a invisible, intangible, silent being and no being at all? And that's the kind of driver home. Now, obviously, well, yeah, you would have a response to that argument, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah. Do you want me to give one?
Yeah, just lay out one, okay. Because I'm about to transfer that argument further. So let's hear a response to that before we go further. Okay.
Well, I will say that that an atheist that once tried to use the invisible pink unicorn argument with me, I kind of irritated him because I said, well, I can disprove you have an invisible pink unicorn because only visible things can have color because you have to reflect the light in order to be colored. So you can't have a unicorn that's both invisible and pink. So it has contradictory attributes. And that didn't sit well with him. But I use that, of course, to illustrate that, whether or not you can prove it, you could at least disprove that such a thing would exist. But just talking about an invisible an invisible dragon, I would say essentially the response I would give is that an invisible dragon such as that you described is not analogous to the God of the Bible, because for one thing, God may be silent to most of us mere mortals, and he may speak to our heart through scripture, but he has spoken audibly to some people. And so, he's not silent. He has spoken audibly to some, and he has given them instructions. And in this book, the Bible, we actually have books that were written by such people. So if we have good reason to believe that the Bible is divinely inspired, then we have good reason to believe that God has also, reached down into humanity, has spoken to some people, has guided, human development in some cases, and that kind of thing. So I would just kind of say that these two just are not comparable situations.
Yeah, so when we argue for God, this argument demands empirical evidence, something you can see and touch and hear. And we could say that, yes, we do have empirical evidence from God because God came down and spoke and was touched. John makes a big deal of that in both his gospel and his epistles. We have seen and heard and touched. He uses those exact words. He's making an empirical argument for God in the form of Jesus Christ. So giving evidence such as you alluded to for the historicity of Christ and the resurrection would be one response to this, because it addresses the empirical aspect of the account. And many arguments that we can make for God are not necessarily empirical. They're more metaphysical, because God is essentially a metaphysical being. And we can say that, yes, we can show that metaphysical things that you can't hear, touch, or see do exist, because we refer to them when we make judgments of right and wrong. We're referring to a metaphysical concept of morality. And then, if I were to say, okay, so you're an atheist, you say God doesn't exist. I'm a Christian, I say God exists. So maybe God both exists and doesn't exist. Well, then the atheist would be completely right in saying that I've just violated the law of non-contradiction, which says that you can't have both A and not A at the same time and in the same way. And the law of non-contradiction is a law of logic, which is metaphysical. It's abstract. It exists, but it's not seeable, touchable, or hearable. And so if you can demonstrate that there are metaphysical concepts that we can show, then it's not beyond the realm of possibility that there is a metaphysical being.
Right. And we'd probably be triggering Tyler right now, too, because he doesn't believe atheists can account for the laws of logic. So I don't think Tyler would think that the atheist has recourse to pointing to logic.
Well, Tyler is a presuppositionalist, and what I just gave was a presuppositionalist argument, the core of one.
Right.
So at any rate, yes. So we can both show...
I agree with you. So.
Yeah. We can both show that there is empirical evidence for the existence of God in the form of Jesus Christ, who was physical and observable, and that there are physical arguments that if one allows for the existence of things like love and beauty and goodness and morality and power, wisdom, all of these things that are metaphysical, consciousness being another one, then one has to allow that such a being is possible. Now, I imagine there's a more robust way of putting that argument, but that's not the show we're doing right now. So,
right. Yeah.
All right. So now to transfer the invisible dragon / pink unicorn / gardener example to my argument, it would be this. All right. Let me sit here and contemplate God world. All right. So you've got a world in which God is the only thing that exists. God is metaphysical and abstract. So he doesn't occupy space, and there's no space to occupy. He doesn't exhibit any energy. He has properties that he doesn't exercise, therefore he is static. And what is the difference between an invisible, intangible, static being and no being at all? And so this would get into sort of a Kantian argument that to exist is to act, And for God, let me give an example of me. If I raise my arm right now, I've just displaced the atmosphere around me, and I've moved through space. To act is to act. When you act, you affect things external to yourself. One of God's attributes, one of the things that we consider to be fundamental to his nature, is creator. But he's not a creator if he doesn't create. The very act of being God is to create. Now, you could say something to the effect of, well, wasn't there a time that God did not create? Well, no, because there was no time before creation.
Yeah, the
and
question
so
would be meaningless.
I would say that creation is an eternal act of God, meaning that there was no time at which God did not create. That was just a fundamental thing that God did. But why? Why an external universe to himself? Well, first of all, I don't think that God could both exist and also be static. To exist is to act. I would agree with Kant there. So why the universe that we see? Well, my response to that would be this. Again, referring back to Kant, that we take it as a given that God has certain attributes. God is loving, God is just, God is wise, God is powerful, and you could go down the list. But is God loving if he doesn't love? Is he just if he doesn't exercise justice? Is he wise if he doesn't exercise wisdom? In other words, to be is to do. And the only way that God could exercise justice, you could argue that God could exercise love in a universe with only God, because we've got the Trinity to kind of take care of that problem. But God could not exercise justice because there is no injustice in a world that's just God. God could not exercise mercy. There's no one to be merciful to. You could possibly say that God could exercise wisdom, but what is there to know or to think if you're the only thing that exists in the universe? Well, you might say, well, God could delve into his own attributes. But as I've just argued, God's attributes are only existent insofar as they are exercised. I could call myself a carpenter right now. Now, I don't actually have a carpentry shop. I don't own a bandsaw or a lathe or any of the, things of carpentry, and I've never built anything. So in what sense am I a carpenter? Well, you could say I'm potentially a carpenter.
Could I push back on that a little bit?
Sure.
Because couldn't we say that instead of needing to act as a carpenter in order to be a carpenter, that the skills and equipment you've amassed is what makes you a carpenter? Because, for example, if you start a carpentry business, but no one ever calls you, you never get any business, and you eventually have to close down, would you say that you never were a carpenter, or would you say you were a carpenter, you just weren't able to get any work while you had that carpentry business going?
But you notice that what you just did was say you get a business, you obtain equipment, you start. Everything that you've just named are actions that I've taken.
So that would be acts of carpentry then, in your view?
Those would be acts. I'm saying I'm a carpenter and I'm sitting here doing zero things. If I were to sit in this chair and not move for the remainder of my life, could you call me a carpenter?
Well,
you could call me a potential carpenter, but not an actual carpenter. And so I would argue that in order to, God had a lot of, say, potential energy, if you will, sitting there doing nothing and remaining static.
Are we getting into Aristotelian territory here with potency and act?
Very likely we are.
Yeah.
Now, let me bring it down to a further level and speak biblically. All right, so God creates a universe. in so doing, he's exercised at least some of his attributes, his creativity for one. And you could argue his wisdom and his power and some other things like that, just in the act of creation. Okay. Now, you might raise the objection that if God always created, is creation co-eternal to God? Well, no, because God existed prior to creation, and I mean causally prior to creation. Even, and William Lane Craig, I've heard him make this argument that you could have a chain holding up a chandelier, but the chain is causally prior to the chandelier staying in the air. Or he uses a bowling ball depressing a mattress. The depression and the bowling ball exist simultaneously, but the bowling ball is causal towards the depression. And I could say the same thing about God and creation. If God always created, there was never a time he didn't create. He's still prior to creation insofar as he's causally prior to creation. If we were getting into sort of Thomist thinking here, you could even say that God maintains creation, right? His power is what allows creation to remain in existence, if you will. Have I misrepresented
No.
Aquinas there?
No, I mean, Aquinas would say the same thing, that God created the universe, but and Aquinas, thought it irrelevant whether or not the universe had a beginning or whether it was eternal, because God would still need to exist to keep everything going, to sustain the universe in existence. God is there at the beginning of the causal chain of the universe, but he's also necessary to sustain the universe in existence. So
Right.
That'd be along the same lines there.
So, yeah, and in that sense, we don't really even need to have a first point, although I think we can prove philosophically and scientifically that there was a first point where the universe began to exist.
Mm-hmm. Aquinas lived, in the ancient world where, we did not have access to modern cosmology. So using modern cosmology, we can make a case that the universe had a beginning.
Right. Absolutely. So creation was a necessary act of God because God is creator. That's one of his attributes. Now, let me bring that down to a biblical level. In the book of, I believe, Exodus, God is sort of doing his kind of prequel to the giving of the law, where he's saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. And as he's sort of listing his acts and his attributes, he says that I am the God who is merciful and loving, forgiving. I wish I had that verse memorized, but he kind of gives this idea that he's always forgiving. He's sort of, what do you call that? Ever patient, long suffering.
Long-suffering, yeah.
Yeah, and all of that. And then he immediately transitions from that into the statement, but I will no wise excuse the wicked, visiting the sins of the fathers upon their sons to the third and fourth generation. And if you read that, and you really read that, it's a paradox. Right off the bat, God contradicts himself. He says that I am loving and I am forgiving, period. Forgiving is what and again, I wish I remembered the exact wording of that, because the indication was that he always forgives. He is eternally and ever forgiving. And then immediately he transitions into his justice. And his justice cannot abide wickedness. And so he will no wise clear the wicked. And he will visit the sins of the sons upon their or the fathers upon their sons for the third and fourth generation, which is a really harsh thing to say. And it leaves one sort of puzzling and scratching one's head when you see that. Right off the bat, forgiveness, mercy, and grace, these are things that we link inextricably with God. God is sort of the source of these things. But also God is just and perfect and holy and righteous and cannot abide sin and wickedness. So here we have a contradiction in God's nature. Fortunately, the Bible gives us a resolution where God can be perfectly just and perfectly loving and forgiving. And that is in the work of Christ. Now, the Bible itself, taken as a meta-narrative, as one continuous story, poses this problem and then progresses to a resolution of the problem, which is where we stand doctrinally now, that God has resolved this part of his nature, which appears to be in conflict, without the work of Christ. And so in the act of creating the universe, God created a story. And if we allow that God, that's a fly.
All right.
You'll see it from time to time.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. It covers the screen periodically, but
yeah.
No, obviously, this is an audio podcast, so they're not going to care about that.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I don't have the time to edit these anymore. So
you don't?
They'll get the commentary nonetheless.
Oh, okay.
Clint and I, for the audience, Clint and I are looking at each other because we're on camera.
Right.
And there's a fly flying around my office, and it periodically lands on the camera, which is a really specific spot for it to land, but
right. Yeah.
It's decided that's the location.
Yep.
Anyway, so I was saying, you have God, he creates, and in creation, he exercises, not reveals. This is the mistake that my father and I made originally, is that, well, God is revealing his nature, which indicates that, these things are sort of inextricably part of who God is, and he's just sort of showing them. But the argument I'm making here is that, no, God is actualizing his nature. Much like I'm not both a carpenter and not a carpenter, sitting here doing zero things related to carpentry does not make me a carpenter. In order to be a carpenter, I have to carpent.
Right.
I just coined a word.
Yeah.
Happened here first.
Well, carpenter.
Y'all heard it.
One who carpents. So yeah.
Yes. And the same thing is true of God. In order to be just, God has to exercise justice. In order to be wise, God exercises wisdom. This is, again, the sort of Kantian argument that to be is to do. And I suppose you could even reverse that. To do is to be. Either way, God has to do something.
And
he can't remain in solipsism.
And what about the Frank Sinatran argument? Do.
Oh, dang. You just totally defeated my argument.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. So, the universe that God created not only allowed God to exercise all of his attributes and thereby actualize himself as a loving being, as a forgiving being, and so on and so forth. But it also was for the specific work of Christ. I have not developed this argument beyond this point, but I suppose you could possibly even make the argument that in order to have the Trinity, as in three specific natures of God, each of those natures needs to distinguish itself. And again, that could not occur in a static universe where God exists and does nothing. And so the very fact of the Trinity begs the existence of a universe in which God acts on things that are external to himself. And so this revelation, assuming you're willing to buy into it, I've begun to call the necessary world theology. That's my own term. You won't find it anywhere beyond me. And I find that if you dig into this particular line of thought, it addresses practically every objection and resolves most of the problems theologically that you have. I use this as my sort of answer to the free will versus sovereignty difficulty. I won't get into that too much, but you have this argument in the book of Romans that Calvinists really enjoy bringing out, and it's the argument of the vessels formed by God. He has vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy. Now, I've just argued that wrath and mercy, or as I would put it, justice and mercy, are both intrinsic to God's nature. But in order to be both just and merciful, he has to exercise justice and mercy. Now, in order to exercise them, there has to be some kind of imperfection that his justice and mercy work to resolve. And so, in that respect, there are no useless people at any point in history, because every single individual in existence has acted in some way. And to an extent, you could say that God has reacted, either with justice or with mercy. And in so doing, he has actualized that aspect of his nature. The actions of human beings are what actualize, well, I don't want to say our actions actualize God, but God is actualized in respect to our behaviors, in the way that he responds with justice or mercy, respectively. Okay, so that's my basic argument. That's my basic response. And again, this is why I love this argument so much, because it has given me so much theological insight, and it's allowed me to create a line of theological reasoning which has guided my sort of interaction with Scripture and with my Christian beliefs ever since.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you respond.
Yeah, well, Edward Fazer, a Christian philosopher who teaches at University of California, Pasadena, or Pasadena City College, I think is what it's called. As critical and harsh as he is toward the new atheists, he says that Christians do owe the new atheists a debt of gratitude, because it's forced us to have to come up with more sophisticated arguments, because Christianity as a whole had kind of gotten just kind of complacent in their intellectual pursuits. And here come these new atheists with really bad arguments, but bad arguments that Christians were struggling to answer. So it's really caused the Christian church, especially among popularizers, to really step up their game and help teach Christians better arguments and how to respond to these atheists. So it's always good when we have these kinds of arguments, which help us to think deeper about our faith and come up with better responses to these kinds of things.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And I've made that argument myself. If you look prior to the year 2001, the word apologetics was practically non-existent in the average Christian's vocabulary. Yeah. I think the only popularizer of apologetics that had any visibility at the time was probably Ravi Zacharias. And beyond that, it was just not a thing that Christians knew about. Since the dawning of the new atheism, there's been a boom in a Christian apologetics, and you and I probably would not be talking right now if it had not been for the rise of new atheism.
That's a very good possibility. Yeah. So, when thinking on this, first, I'll quickly address the less sophisticated version that you brought up, and then move on to the God world one. This idea about God needing to create, meaning that he's not perfect. Again, this is, regarding the really kind of bad way that my Sunday school teacher responded to this kind of idea about why God created human beings. I've come to learn since then, reading apologetics, reading philosophy, that, God was perfect, and God exists as a trinity, a triune being, where there's three persons in one essence. God essentially exists as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so, so we know that God is love, but we also know that love is not selfish. So if God were just loving himself, that would be a selfish love. But because there are three persons in the Godhead, God's love is not a selfish love. It's a selfless one, because he has three beings within himself that he spreads his love to. So
may I interrupt you for a moment there?
Sure.
Okay. In reference to that, I'd like to, again, when I say that, I'm talking about the Trinity specifically. I'd like to develop that a little bit related to my argument, and I'm not going to take a long time with this. Just briefly, who died on the cross? Which of the Trinity, who died on the cross?
The second person of the Trinity.
Right. God the Son.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Who came and anointed the disciples on the day of Pentecost?
That would be the Son.
Okay. The Son came.
Or, you mean when it descended like
tongues of fire on their heads, speaking in different languages?
That would be the Holy Spirit.
Okay. So we see that
almost made a critical theological error there.
Yeah, almost. Yeah. So we see that the members of the Trinity distinguish themselves somewhat in that they each take specific roles that they behave. God the Father did not die on the cross, and God the Son did not come on the day of Pentecost and anoint the disciples. Each of the members of the Trinity have acted in specific ways, which allows us at least to distinguish somewhat between them and their roles. Now,
Right.
I am not making any deep theological points on the nature of the Trinity. I'm tying this back to my idea that God, this is an act of actualization. It allows each member of the Trinity to actualize in that they act. Correct?
Right.
Okay. That's all I wanted to say. Continue, please.
Yeah, and so where I was going with that, it was just to bring that home to the question of creation, that God was not lonely because he had the three members of the Trinity within himself. So he was not lonely either, and in need of companionship. So that's also why Christian philosophers would argue that the Christian God is preferable over the non-Trinitarian gods of the Jews and of the Muslims, because God is a Trinity. If God, some of these potential criticisms, these paradoxes of how God can be loving and how God can not be lonely, these are resolved by the Christian God, because the Christian God has revealed himself as a Trinity, not as just one God, with only one. I'm not trying to describe that, because we Christians believe that God is one God, but three persons within one essence. So so the Christian God best resolves these paradoxes of how God can be loving and how God can not be lonely from creation when he created. So God
just
existing
briefly again to jump back in, I had said before that my necessary world argument or sort of structure has allowed me to resolve a lot of theological difficulties, and I just gave you a demonstration of that because the Trinity is a very, very difficult theological issue to understand at the very least and to articulate. And I gave you a demonstration of how the necessary world theology can somewhat address the difficulty of the Trinity, because we see that there are specific members of the Trinity who distinguish themselves by acting in specific ways that the others didn't. God the Father did not die on the cross. That is not to say that Jesus and God are not one. It's to say that there is a specific member of the Trinity that did a specific action that actualized that member of the Trinity and distinguished that member of the Trinity from the others. And so, again, this idea of acting is to actualize helps us to understand the nature of the Trinity somewhat. Please continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so God existing as a Trinity, resolves these difficulties. It means that God was not lonely, which is why God created. So then, of course, the question is, if it wasn't out of loneliness, then why did God feel the need to create? And Joel, you had a specific response to this, and I would actually just frame it differently, even though I think we're essentially getting at the same idea. I would just kind of frame it a little bit differently. I would say that God created because it's in his nature to create. I do think that there's an element of why God created, because it's to reveal his glory. And I think that God did create to reveal his glory to us, but I don't think that's the most fundamental reason, because as you and your father would say, there was no one around here to show your glory, to show God's glory to. So it's not like God created the universe itself to proclaim glory to human beings, because there were no human beings at the time.
Right. So if you say that God created his own audience in order to show them something, that's not much different than what your Sunday school teacher was saying, in that God was lonely and therefore he created other people to give love to.
Right. But then I would say that there is an element of that, though, that God did create to bring glory to himself with us as the audience, because God, of course, wants to spend eternity with us. And the only way to do that is to bring us into a loving relationship with him. So God did not create originally for that purpose. But, you'll often hear atheists say, well, why did God create a whole vast universe with only a very, very small, tiny little percentage that humans can actually survive on? And I would say that's so that, because obviously the universe proclaims his glory. That's so, as scripture teaches, the universe itself proclaims God's glory, so that people are without excuse on that day of judgment. So I think there is an element that the universe brings glory to God for our benefit, but that's not why God originally created. God originally created simply because it's in his nature to create. He is creative by nature. And as you said, you're not really a creator until you've created. And so like I said, this is very similar. And I think we're probably getting at the same idea, but I would just say that because it's in God's nature to create, he can't do anything but create. He could not create because it's in his nature to create. So just like it's in his nature to forgive, it's in his nature to be just, it's in his nature to love, he cannot not do these things because they're in his nature to do. Similarly, because it's in God's nature, God could not refrain from creating. He had to create because otherwise, if you've never created anything, then you could not call yourself a creator. And so if God is creative by nature, then he has to create. Otherwise, you can't in any real sense, like you were saying, you can't in any real sense say that he is a creator in that case.
Yeah. So my dad would always put it this way. He would say that God would never do anything that God would not do. Mm-hmm. This was his method of saying that, God acts out of his nature.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so that's essentially how I would answer the question about, why God actually needed to create. It simply boils down to it's in his nature. But, God did create the vast universe. He created the universe with us in mind. He created the earth where we could survive on. He created this, as it teaches in Genesis, he created the stars and the sun and the moon for seasons and things like that. And he created the vast universe because he is creative, and that brings glory to God, and God wants to spend an eternity with us. So there's an element that the universe proclaims God's glory to us and for our benefit, but that's not why God originally created. So, God is just by nature a creator. And then moving on to this more sophisticated God world argument about, a world of just God would be a perfect world. And by God creating things, he would be reducing essentially the perfectness of the universe. And to that, I would simply say it depends on what your not preference. What's the word I'm looking for here? It depends on what your
definition. No,
not really definition. It depends on what your, I guess, sort of like your preference. It depends on what form of perfection you prefer, because God is morally perfect, but there are other forms of perfection. There are non-moral definitions of perfection. When we read in the book of Genesis that when God created the universe and then created mankind, he looked at it and he said, it is good. So God himself considered it all to be good, even though he knew that mankind would in the future sin and bring sin into the universe. You could say that God did diminish the moral perfection of the universe, but that doesn't seem to be the kind of universe that God was going for. I mean, God is a perfect God and cannot sin himself, and he requires perfection out of moral agents. But it seemed like, God just desired a universe where he could create. And if God has to create, then obviously God has to create. He can't just not create. And so the things that God created were good, and the people that God created were good. And God obviously considered a world of free creatures better than a world of automatons who were not free. And so God gave us free will. And so it's not God's fault that the universe, human beings sinned, and that the universe started, that God essentially had to curse the creation, to sprout thorns or whatever. So all of this isn't necessarily God's doing, in that he did not cause these things to be. You could say that it was God's doing in that he didn't prevent it, or that he created the universe and mankind and gave us free will. So he, at the very least, gave us the elements to set all of that in motion, but he did not physically cause these things to happen. So to that kind of God world argument, I would just say, if God is a perfect creator, then I would just kind of channel Alvin Plantinga and say, if you believe that God as a perfect being would only desire a perfect universe, why think a thing like that? On what grounds would you think that God would not settle for less perfect things in order to create certain things that he wanted to create? Because obviously, if God exists, if the Christian God exists, and I think that there's good reason to suppose the Christian God exists, then it seems like God was willing to at least tolerate less than perfect things. Tolerate sin coming into the universe because mankind would sin. Tolerate the universe running down once once it happened, because God created a physical universe, and physical things eventually wear out and run down. So God, by creating a physical universe, created a universe that wasn't going to be around forever because he created a universe physically. So on what grounds should we believe that a perfect God would only settle for creating things that were absolutely perfect? I just don't think there's really any reason to assume that a God would only settle for perfect things and not tolerate imperfect things for the purpose of creating.
Okay, so I'm going to respond to that point specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll start by this. Let's say that we lived in a perfectly good world. Now, if I were to exist in a perfectly good world, and I were to rise right now and move this chair over there, the thing that I just did would be good by definition. I'm in a perfectly good universe. In a perfectly good universe, all things that occur are perfectly good. And so if I move the piece of furniture, it's because moving furniture is essentially in its own nature good. It is good to move furniture.
Is it morally good to move furniture, though?
Well, goodness has qualities that extend beyond morality. Again, that's just a rote example of an action that really has no moral content to it, but you could indue moral content into it by saying that, I was doing it to assist someone. But here's the thing. You just brought the issue of morality into that. There is a passage in the New Testament, and I unfortunately don't know the reference, but it's Jesus, I believe, who is speaking. And he says something to the effect of, you will come to me and you will say, for me, I did this, that, and the other. And you will get no reward because you're just doing what you were supposed to do as servants. You're not doing anything exceptional for me. You're doing what you were supposed to do, what it is your duty to do. Mm-hmm. To not perform those actions would be bad. In a perfectly in a perfect universe, everything that I do, I'm obligated to do because that is the right thing to do. Now, you brought the issue of morality into it. To have morality, there has to be some kind of imperfection, and I'll demonstrate it this way. So my kids occasionally sit in and watch the news with their mother, and it gets them very depressed because there's a lot of bad things that happen in the world. Mm-hmm. And so I have made it my mission, especially with my daughter, to sort of show that whereas the news focuses on the bad things, there is goodness and beauty and love and good qualities in the universe. And what the thing that you see in the universe is the thing you focus on. If you only ever focus on the bad stuff, all you'll see is bad. And so we've started to try to find news stories and things that happen in the world that demonstrate that good things exist. And so we'll come with stories like this. There's a bridge in Japan, and it's called Suicide Bridge because every night dozens of people get up there and jump to their death off of this bridge for various reasons. Essentially, these are suicidal people. And if you are suicidal, this is the place to go to commit suicide. Apparently, they don't disallow that. There's no sort of police presence that prevents people from doing that. And so in this story, there was a math teacher who at the end of the day, he would get off of work and then he would go out to this bridge at night and he would approach these people who were about to commit suicide and he would hug them and he would start ministering to them and he would convince them not to commit suicide. And this was his night job. This is all he did. It was voluntary and he did it out of the goodness of his heart, not because somebody was compelling him to do so. This is a praiseworthy thing. This was a good story. There was a story that we found about a high schooler who was blind, and he really wanted to participate in the track and field team. But being blind, it's very difficult to participate in track and field. And so his little brother, who was a year or two younger than him, would come out and basically, I don't think he held his hand, but perhaps he had a rope or something that he held to guide his brother along the track as he ran. Problem is, in order to do that, the little brother had to exercise and had to go above and beyond to get fast so that he could keep pace with these older boys so that he could help his brother. Again, this is a really good story. It's a very praiseworthy thing, but it would not exist if there weren't imperfections. And I would challenge you to come up with an example of something praiseworthy that didn't involve some kind of imperfection, some kind of difficulty that was then overcome. If we live in a perfect world, what kind of exceptional thing could we do in a world that is already intrinsically perfect?
Yeah, that's a thinker.
I would say that there is no praiseworthy thing. There is no above and beyond in a perfect world.
So
When
in a
all
perfect world,
things are
everything would be obligatory. Nothing would be supererogatory. Things that we could do over and above the call of duty.
Correct. In a perfect world, we would act perfectly, and we would be obligated to do so because we're in a perfect world. To fail to get up 2 minutes later than I needed to in order to perform a task would be imperfect. So I would always rise at the exact time that I needed to. I could rise earlier than I needed to, but then there's a period of time that I'm not doing anything. And so there's this period of time that's static that could arguably be less than perfect. So I would always rise right on time. It's only in a world in which impurities exist that there are, as you said, supererogatory acts that can occur. Now, again, I have laid out why I think that there exists a universe that we are seeing here, and that is this alleged contradiction in God's nature, where he has to be perfectly good and holy in such a way that he cannot abide imperfections. Now, the God world argument argues that to create something external to himself, he's already created an imperfection insofar as that thing external to himself is less than maximally good. It's not perfect. Now, I mean, you could argue that, say God creates a screwdriver. The screwdriver that God creates is going to be exactly right for performing the task that it was created for, to drive screws. It's going to be the exact correct length and measurements and, give the exact amount of torque necessary to perform that task. Everything about it is going to be perfect for being a screwdriver.
Right.
So, and this is what we've said. We've said that this is the kind of universe that God created was a universe that was perfect, but then free will kind of went and undid that to a degree. And I would argue that was a necessary act in the course of creating a perfect world. And this is how I would say this. Yes, God, to have a perfect world, you need to have free will creatures who, of their own free will, choose to act in a way that is perfect. But to create beings that are less than perfect, less than God, less than maximally great, is to create beings that are going to at some point fail. And so we've got a universe in which we have lots of failure, lots of people doing things they ought not to do. And we've also got a world in which the redeeming work of Christ has allowed for any individual to freely choose to accept the grace and forgiveness that's been extended to them and then be redeemed through that act. Now, at some point, according to most versions of eschatology.
Right. All those words.
Right. We have a point in the future at which God will recreate the universe in a perfect state. But this universe will not be peopled with new beings that God creates along with that universe. It will be peopled by resurrected beings from the universe in which we currently exist. But those resurrected beings will have been perfected by their own free will. So in order to have a perfect universe, you must first have the universe we're existing in, such that the perfect universe to come is peopled with people that both have free will and also act perfectly. So this is my answer to the problem of evil argument, is that God, they say, why couldn't God just create a perfect universe? Why couldn't he create it with free will beings that he knows are just going to choose of their own free will to act perfectly? I would say this is exactly what he's doing, but it is a progressive process. And one of the stages requires the universe that we're currently in.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good, because I've been wondering about this too, because one of my biggest questions about Scripture is, like you said, God is going to create a new heaven and new earth, and he is going to sorry, that's my dog. He's going to populate it with us, people who had free will but would go wrong. And how in such a world, how are we going to have free will and yet also choose to do the right thing? And I've had a similar thought to what you were saying, although I think you put it better than I would, that I think this world that we're in here is just kind of a trial for that. And that by going through and obeying God's laws and, as best as we are able, I think that might in some way work toward the future world and, and helping us to be free creatures, but also, not sin. So that's something that I've been pondering as well. And I think I think you make a good point.
Oh, to throw it back to my carpentry example. Well, I want to be a carpenter. And so I do the I dream of Jeannie thing, and I nod my head and blink my eyes, and there's a perfect chair.
I think she wiggled her nose on that.
No, that would be the Bewitched.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Okay.
Samantha from Bewitched wiggled her nose. Jeannie from I Dream of Jeannie did the cross arms.
That's right. That's right.
Anyway, so I do that, and there's a chair. All right. So I have just, out of thin air, what do they call that? Ex nihilo?
Ex nihilo.
Yeah, ex nihilo, created the perfect chair. Am I a carpenter at that point? I would say no, because I have not performed any carpentry.
So there are no shortcuts to carpentry, is what you're saying?
Well, no. I mean, I'm saying that you could easily, if you had the power to do so, you could easily just wink and create all the perfect furniture and cabinets and houses and things in the world. And that's fine. That's a shortcut. But that doesn't make you a carpenter. In order to be a carpenter, you have to actually do carpentry.
Yeah.
I am not a sewer if I don't sew. If all garments are, without any kind of stitching, then I've created garments. I'm, I don't know, a garment creator, but I'm not a sewer because I haven't sewn. To be a carpenter, I have to carpent. And so this is what I'm saying about God. God is creating a perfect world, but he is doing so progressively. He is going through the various acts that it takes to create that perfect world. And in so doing, he is exercising his attributes. He's actualizing himself. So two things are being accomplished in the universe that we see. The first is that it's building towards the perfect universe in which there are free will creatures that have exercised their free will such that they are capable of acting perfectly. And first they have to make mistakes before they get to that point. Right. Additionally, God is actualizing his nature in this world as he builds the perfect world. So in order to build a chair, I have to take this piece of wood and I have to take a lathe to it, and I have to shape it, which requires me to peel wood off of it. There is this sort of imperfect element about the raw wood that requires working in order to become the perfect object from which to build this chair. God is building a perfect universe, and there is a process to do so. And if God does not engage in this process, he blinks, he does the I Dream of Jeannie, and there's the perfect world, but there's no free will. Now, you get this idea. I think this is I'm missing his name. He's one of the better atheist philosophers nowadays. But anyway, he asked the question of he states that there can be no heaven in which one it has free will, for the reason that, this is the argument we typically say, well, to have free will means making mistakes, but heaven is perfect, so there can't be any mistakes, so there can't be any free will. I would respond to that argument as I just did, that we have free will and we've exercised our free will in order to build a world in which we are both free and also sinless. But I would also, respond to his argument by saying it is possible for me to both have free will and also have freedom, and by this I mean, in Genesis, God creates an argument. He creates a garden, and he turns to Adam and he says that you may eat of all the trees of this garden except this one. Now, we focus on the sort of restriction there, but we don't focus on is the freedom there. If Adam had gone to the orange tree instead of the mango tree, there would be no sin in that. If he had chosen to go the mango instead of the orange, there would be no sin in that. He was free to do any number of good things that he freely chose to do. He just had the boundaries that were placed on him in restriction of the single tree. And this is what I'm saying about free will. It is possible to both be perfect and also exercise free will because there are multiple different avenues of acting perfectly. I could be either an artist or a poet. Both of those things are good things to do, assuming that I'm a perfect artist and a perfect poet. But my point is, I have the option of making that decision. I can freely choose to do one good thing instead of do the other good thing. So, if we allow that it is possible to not sin, we can still say that we live in a world in which there is freedom to choose one thing over another thing, as long as both of those decisions are equally good.
Right.
So, yeah, I would, I'd respond to him, first of all, by saying it's possible to get to that world where we are both free will and also don't make mistakes by transitioning through the world that we're in. And it's also possible to live in a world of perfect freedom where all of the things that we choose to do are good.
Yeah, that makes me kind of wonder because the only restriction God gave Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden was do not eat the tree of the, do not eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It makes me kind of wonder if in the new heaven and new earth, if maybe the laws that we have to live by are not going to be as stringent as the ones we have here. Because, there were like 635 laws in the Old Testament. And that's
613.
Oh, 613. Okay.
Get it straight.
Don't add any more than necessary.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it kind of makes me wonder if, if even in that case, there's going to be, fewer laws in the new heaven and new earth than we have here. Obviously the big ones will still apply, don't commit adultery, don't murder anybody. If you could murder someone, I don't know how that's going to play out there. But even the attempt would be wrong. Even if you can't murder someone, to at least attempt it would still be
even the thought
wrong,
would be wrong.
Right. So I constantly wonder about all that. And that's just kind of one of these things that I just kind of take on faith that God knows what He's doing.
Well, my response to that would be that through the redemptive process, we have achieved the Christ-like ability. Theologians will say that Christ had two attributes specifically. One was the he was not able to sin, and he was able not to sin. Now we are not able not to sin, and we are able to sin first. We don't have that restriction.
Right.
But we are not able not to sin. I think that once we have undergone the redemptive process and become like Christ, we will live in a world where the law will be do as thou will. And this is the argument made by what's his name, the magician guy. Penn Teller. Penn Teller. And Penn Jillette. He's like, Christians say that without God, you wouldn't rape and kill and steal and all this stuff.
Yeah,
and he
I've seen the
says,
video.
I do exactly the amount of raping and killing and stealing that I want to, which is none.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. I think that this is the world in which we will live. The law will be do as thou will, but our will be perfected. But again, if God had gone ahead and created us with perfected will, there would not be that freedom to choose. The only reason we have perfected will in the new heaven and in the new earth is we have chosen to do so. So that is my response to that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think.
Well, that was my contribution. Anything to add?
No, I mean, I've added about all I could. I mean, those are the ways that I would respond to these, and yeah, I like the way that you would respond to the problem of evil and the problem of non-God objects. So, yeah, that's the one I've had less time to think about, because the one about why would God create if He was perfect. I've had since I was a kid and had that Sunday school teacher to think about that one, but yeah.
No. Yeah, I mean, the problem of non-God objects shaped so much of my current theology that I owe, as you said, a great debt of gratitude to the new atheist.
Right.
Because, the answer that I just gave to evil and suffering stems from my response to the non-God object, what I've called the necessary world theology, which is to say the world in which we live right now is necessary towards the ultimate goal of creation.
Right.
It's almost an evolutionary argument because, and this is something that young earth creationists very much dislike about the idea of evolution, is that there's sort of these stages of death and, rebirth, not rebirth. Sorry, new ageism. There's
right.
This cycle of sort of death and development that goes into evolution. So there's kind of death and suffering that leads up to, the Genesis 1 world
Right.
that is supposedly perfect. And, the idea being that the only reason that death and suffering existed at all was the sin that humans did to bring that into the world. But that aside, what I'm saying here is it's an evolutionary argument towards the perfect universe, that this is a necessary stage in building the perfect universe. And much like a carpenter who doesn't carpent, God is not a God who does not exercise the attributes that are essential to his nature toward building this perfect universe,
Right.
In which his nature is ultimately fulfilled. Meaning God doesn't need the universe. God needs to fulfill his nature. The universe is a byproduct of that act. But that act, again, is internal to himself. He desires to actualize himself, but that desire is internal, and that decision is internal. So, the world is a byproduct of God's exercise or activity, not the purpose of God's exercise and activity. Right. And that's sort of a difficulty I have with the problem of evil there, is it tends to assume that we human beings are the purpose for God's existence, and therefore when God does not allow us to have perfect comfort and, the best lives that we can, sort of the Joel Osteen life.
Right. Live your best life now.
Yeah, exactly. Then God is not perfect. But that's to misunderstand God's nature, which is perfectly loving, but he is the number one object of his love.
Yeah.
Which is another Christian philosopher whose name I don't know that said that. All right. Well, it's been a good show. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah. Same
nice
here.
to be back on the air. Let's do this again sometime.
Yeah. Yeah.
It may be mostly you and me from here on out.
Oh, you think so?
That's possible. Who knows? It's the mentionables. There's a cycle. There's a rotation.
That's true. Nick said that he couldn't make it because he was going to be at ETS this week. So maybe Nick will be able to make it in the future.
Yeah, possibly. All right. Well, you've been listening to The Mentionables. I say that to the audience because, unfortunately, I don't have the luxury of editing these episodes any longer. So you get the raw and uncut version of these episodes with all the mistakes and the flies that are on the cameras and all of those things. Clinton's dog in the background.
Right.
All of it. Because that's what we are as The Mentionables. We're raw.
That's right.
All right. You've been listening to The Mentionables. We'll talk to you later.
The Mentionables. untitled.org.
We are The Mentionables.